The Hyperboreans were a people described by Greek sources as the favorites of Apollo. They lived far to the north, beyond the north wind Boreas, which was traditionally situated in the land of Thrace. Ancient scholars, as well as modern theorists, have placed Hyperborea alternatively in Britain, Scandinavia, Gaul, Siberia, or even the North Pole. Some sources were skeptical of their existence. Others claimed to have had direct experience with Hyperborean visitors. They were described as attractive, tall, leading long and yet youthful lives full of music, philosophy, and love. They were sometimes described as vegetarian, having no need of toil or war to sustain themselves. It's uncertain how the Greeks came to know of the existence of these Hyperboreans. Herodotus tells us that the oracle at Delphi received offerings from the Hyperboreans on a regular basis.
They say that offerings wrapped in straw are brought from the Hyperboreans to Scythia. When these have passed Scythia, each nation in turn receives them from its neighbors, until they are carried to the Adriatic Sea, which is the most westerly limit of their journey. From there, they are brought onto the south, the people of Dodona being the first Greeks to receive them. From Dodona they come down to the Melian Gulf and are carried across to Euboea, and one city sends them on to another until they come to Charistus. After this, Andros is left out of their journey, for Charistians carry them to Tenos, and Tenians to Delos. Thus they say, these offerings come to Delos. But on the first journey, the Hyperboreans sent 2 maidens bearing the offerings, to whom the Delians give the names Hyperoche and Laodice, and 5 men of their people with them as escort for safe conduct, those who are now called Perpheres, and greatly honored at Delos. But when those whom they sent never returned, they took it amiss that they should be condemned always to be sending people and not getting them back. And so they carry the offerings wrapped in straw to their borders, and tell their neighbors to send them on from their own country to the next. And the offerings, it is said, come by this conveyance to Delos.
We are not told when the first offerings were made, but the continued receipt of these offerings of the Hyperboreans were counted as historical. Herodotus also tells us that Hesiod and Homer wrote on the Hyperboreans. There's no mention in the surviving works of Hesiod and Homer of the Hyperboreans. Herodotus is probably referring to the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women, which was probably not composed by Hesiod and may date to as late as 540 BC. Herodotus himself doubts whether the Homeric work in question, the Epigoni, was indeed composed by Homer, but modern scholars generally place this work, of which we have mere fragments, in the 8th century BC. The first Greek who decided to conduct an expedition to go find the Hyperboreans lived a century later, Aristeas of Proconnesus. Aristeas came from a wealthy family on this island in the Sea of Marmara, just south of Byzantium, and was himself devoted to Apollo. Aristeas wrote a now lost poem called the Aristeas, which recounted what he learned on his journey. Herodotus.
There is also a story related in a poem by Aristeas, son of Costrobius, a man of Proconnesus. This Aristeas, possessed by Phoebus, visited the Isidones. Beyond these, he said, lived the one-eyed Arimaspians, beyond whom are the griffins that guard gold, and beyond these again the Hyperboreans, whose territory reaches to the sea. Except for the Hyperboreans, all these nations, and first the Arimaspians, are always at war with their neighbors. The Isidones were pushed from their lands by the Arimaspians, and the Scythians by the Isidones, and the Cimmerians, living by the southern sea, were hard pressed by the Scythians and left their country.
If, as it seems, Aristeas' poem contained information about the Cimmerian invasion of Asia Minor, then that would give us a terminus postquem for the Arimaspea of 715 BC. The appearance of these new people from the steppe may have represented a motive for Aristeas' journey. Herodotus.
It is said that this Aristeas, who was as well born as any of his townsfolk, went into a fuller's shop at Proconnesus, and there died. The owner shut his shop and went away to tell the dead man's relatives, and the report of Aristeas' death being spread about in the city was disputed by a man of Cyzicus, who had come from the town of Artatis, and said that he had met Aristeas going towards Cyzicus and spoken with him. While he argued vehemently, the relatives of the dead man came to the fuller's shop with all that was necessary for burial. But when the place was opened, there was no Aristeas there, dead or alive. But in the 7th year after that, Aristeas appeared at Proconnesus, and made that poem which the Greeks now call the Arimaspeia, after which he vanished once again. Such is the tale told in these 2 towns. But this, I know, happened to the Metapontines in Italy, 240 years after the second disappearance of Aristeas, as reckoning made at Proconnesus and Metapontum shows me. Aristeas, so the Metapontines say, appeared in their country and told them to set up an altar to Apollo and set beside it a statue bearing the name of Aristeas the Proconnesian. For he said Apollo had come to their country alone of all Italian lands, and he, the man who was now Aristeas, but then when he followed the god had been a crow, had come with him. After saying this, he vanished. The Metapontines, so they say, sent to Delphi and asked the god what the vision of the man could mean, and the Pythian priestess told them to obey the vision, saying that their fortune would be better. They did as instructed. And now there stands beside the image of Apollo a statue bearing the name of Aristeas. A grove of bay trees surrounds it. The image is set in the marketplace. Let it suffice that I have said this much about Aristeas.
The next Greek source to mention the Hyperboreans was Alcman, who Stephanus of Byzantium says mentioned the Isidonians, with whom Aristeas stayed, and the Rhipaean Mountains. These are the famed mountains beyond which the Hyperboreans lived. Aristeas himself may not have used the term Rhipaean Mountains, and in fact may have called these mountains the Caucasus, which led to later geographical confusion. In any case, Alcman got his information, in all likelihood, from Aristeas, so the date of Aristeas' journey must be between the time of Alcman's writing in the late 7th century BC and the Cimmerian invasion of Asia Minor, which began around 715 BC. Alcaeus, writing around the year 600, in his Hymn to Apollo, informs us that when the newborn Apollo received his chariot drawn by swans from his father Zeus, Zeus gave Apollo the mission of going to Delphi to speak of justice and law to the Greeks. Apollo, however, disobeyed his father and went to the land of the Hyperboreans, where he stayed for a year. The 6th century Ionian poet Ananias confused the Hyperboreans for the Scythians. Simonides, who lived from 556 to 468 BC, wrote that the Hyperboreans lived for 1,000 years. The father of geography, Hecataeus of Miletus, 550 to 476 BC, drew on more ancient sources like the Argonautic tradition and poems like Aristeas' Arimaspeia to construct his geography. The fabled Rhipaean Mountains remained a staple in Greek geography for centuries. Hippocrates of Kos wrote in his Air, Water, and Places,
Scythia lies right close to the north and the Rhipaean Mountains, from which blows the north wind. The sun comes nearest to it only at the end of its course, when it reaches the summer solstice, and then it warms it but slightly and for a short time. The winds blowing from hot regions do not reach it, save rarely and with little of force. But from the north there are constantly blowing winds that are chilled by snow, ice, and heavy rains, which never leaving the mountains render them uninhabitable. A thick fog envelops by day the plains upon which the Scythians live, so that winter is perennial, while summer, which is but feeble, lasts only a few days. Near the Arimaspi lie the Rhipaean Mountains, and the region, which, from the likeness to feathers of the snow which is perpetually falling there, is called Pterophoros, a part of the world which nature has written off. It is buried in thick murk, is unproductive except of cold, and holds the icy womb where the north wind is conceived.
These geographical details will be relevant as we search for the probable destination of Aristeas' original journey. The idea that the north wind came from a cave in the mountains is not traceable in Greek literature until after Aristeas's poem. In the Odyssey, Homer says that all the winds are gathered together in a floating island ruled by Aeolus. Several other features of Aristeas's probable narrative cannot be traced to Greek culture, so it does seem that an historical Aristeas, in fact, made a journey and reported back some of these cultural and geographical features to the Greek world. Hellanicus of Lesbos, writing in the late 5th century BC, wrote that the Hyperboreans lived to the north of the Rhipaean Mountains, learned justice, did not eat meat, but only wild fruits. The tradition up to this point seems to place the Hyperboreans in the northeast, since Aristeas passed the Scythians en route. But with Plutarchus, writing around 392 BC, for the first time, the Rhipaean Mountains are identified with the Alps, and all the peoples living beyond the Alps were indifferently called Hyperboreans. Heraclides Ponticus, student of Plato and inventor of the heliocentric theory, followed Plutarchus in his identification of the Rhipaean Mountains with the Alps. Aristotle, however, maintained that the Rhipaean range was far to the northeast. From these and other fragmentary sources, J.D.P. Bolton reconstructs the likely narrative of the Arimaspea.
So the author stated in his poem that, possessed by Apollo, he journeyed beyond the Scythes to a neighbouring people, the long-haired Isidonians dwelling by a river. This was the farthest point he reached, but the Isidonians, with whom he presumably spent some time, if it is correct that he was absent from home for 6 years, gave him an account of the regions beyond. Therein was an immensely high mountain range, covered in darkness and snow, where was the home of a wind in a cavern, a wind identified by Aristeas as Boreas, which at home would have been the north wind, but perhaps described by his informants merely as a cold and powerful wind. Visibility in these parts was further reduced by a rain of feathers which perpetually filled the air. This mountain range was not called Rhipaean until a later date. The Isidonians may have given it a name which Aristeas rendered as Caucasus. Beyond it lived righteous vegetarians, whose domain extended to the outer sea. This folk Aristeas took to be the Hyperboreans, the apparent goal of his journey. The area between the mountains and the Isidonians was rich in gold, or possibly the gold-bearing region was in the mountain themselves. This was guarded, having been thrown up in the process of making their lairs, by monsters called by the poet Griffins, from which it was stolen by certain warlike neighbours of the Isidonians, the Arimaspi. These were one-eyed, hairy savages, equestrian nomads with a wealth of cattle, sheep and goats. They lived now about a gold-bearing river, perhaps flowing into the northern ocean, and perhaps the same as the river about which the Isidonians lived, though these are little more than guesses. But they were not stationary, and the Isidonians themselves were compelled to shift their abode under the hostile pressure of the Arimaspi. So it happened that the Isidonians in their turn drove their neighbours on the other side, the Scythes, from their territory, and this Scythian migration caused the departure of the Cimmerians from their home on the northern shores of the Black Sea. The Isidonians may have told Aristeas other stories too, of cannibals, of another kind of monster inhabiting the region of darkness, which the poet equated with the Gorgons and Phorcides of Greek legend, of giant reeds and of dog-headed men who understood the human tongue, though they had not the use of it, perhaps also some kind of mermen. And Aristeas must have included in his work first-hand observations of the peoples through whom he passed. Possibly he told of the Scythes working iron, living in horse-drawn wagons, eating horseflesh and mare's milk cheese, and how they claimed to be 3 nations descended from the 3 sons of the patriarch Calaxes, of a nation whose women were so manly that he took them for Amazons, of the difficulties of river crossings, and of one broad river which he thought was the phasis of the Argonautic story, joining the inner to the outer sea.
Aristeas then received his information on the territory beyond from the Isidonians. The Isidonians are generally regarded as a historical people of Central Asia. Herodotus tells us,
"It is said to be the custom of the Isidonians that, whenever a man's father dies, all the nearest of kin bring beasts of the flock, and having killed these and cut up the flesh, they also cut up the dead father of their host, and set out all the flesh mixed together for a feast. As for his head, they strip it bare and clean and gild it, and keep it for a sacred relic, to which they offer solemn sacrifice yearly. Every son does this for his father, just like the Greeks in their festivals in honor of the dead. In other respects, these are said to be a law-abiding people too, and the women to have equal power with the men. Of these two, then, we have knowledge, but as for what is north of them, it is from the Isidonies that the tale comes of the one-eyed men and the griffins that guard gold. This is told by the Scythians, who have heard it from them, and we have taken it as true from the Scythians, and call these people by the Scythian name, Arimaspians. For in the Scythian tongue, Arima is one, and Spau is the eye.
On the ritual cannibalism of the Isidonians, compare the 13th century Flemish explorer William of Rubrick's description of a Tibetan custom.
These people have a strange or rather a miserable kind of custom, for when any man's father deceaseth, he assembles all his kindred, and they eat him. Men which were wont to eat the carcasses of their deceased parents, that for pity's sake they might make no other sepulchre for them than their own bowels. Unto this day they make fine cups of the skulls of their parents, to the end that when they drink out of them, they may amidst all their jollities and delights call their dead parents to remembrance.
Can we corroborate the Asian provenance of some other features of Aristeas' tale? Griffins were known to Middle Eastern, Egyptian, and Greek art well before the 7th century BC. But the motif of the Griffomachy, doing battle with the griffins, does not become popular until after the composition of the Arimaspea. Prior to Aristeas, griffins had not been associated with the guarding of gold or treasure. We find, though, some Asian folklore that does match this kind of description. Herodotus himself tells us of the giant gold-guarding ants of India and the Indian robbers who take the gold from these ants. In the Mahabharata, gold paid as tribute is called ant gold. And in the Chinese Chu Tzu, we read,
O soul, come back, for the west holds many perils. The shifting sands stretch on for 100 leagues. You will be swept into the thunderous chasm and dashed into pieces, unable to help yourself. And even should you chance to escape from that, beyond is the empty desert, and red ants as huge as elephants, and wasps as big as gourds.
And from the Shanhai Qing, we read,
To the north of the Condor Mountain is a man called Dashingpo, who holds a halberd in his hand. East of him is the land of Chanfan. The body of Erfu is to the east of Dashingpo. The land of the Chuanfeng is also called the land of the Dogzhong. The appearance of these people is like dogs. The land of the Kui is to the north of the body of Erfu. These people have the faces of men but only one eye. The Cheongchi is like a tiger with wings. To the east of the Cheongchi are giant wasps which look like wasps and the giant ants which look like ants.
These legends are placed in the far west of China and to the north of India. Aristeas, in searching for the northern wind, may have continued traveling east rather than north across Central Asia. And in Central Asia, there are myths about the home of the winds being in a cave in the mountains. And these myths probably have a geographical basis. Douglas Carruthers, the English explorer, writes,
We had frequently heard of the terrors, dangers, and winds of the Dzungarian Gate. We had read the records of such early travellers as Carpini and Rubruck, both of whom mentioned that there blows nearly continuously such a wind through this valley that persons cross it with great danger lest the wind should carry them into the sea. We therefore approached this remarkable geological phenomenon both with interest and a certain amount of anxiety, for the weather was unusually unsettled. Even at a distance, with the Dzungarian Gate lying before us, unseen, we instinctively became aware of its presence. For when we came within sight of Ala Kul, whilst crossing the open foothills of the Barlik Range, some 20 miles from the lake shore and some 2,000 feet above it, we were in absolute stillness, and yet, strangely enough, the waters of Ala Kul were tossed into waves. the white crests being clearly seen with a glass, while even with the naked eye breakers could be distinguished dashing onto the southern shore of an island in the middle of the lake. Although we were becalmed, there was evidently a gale blowing through the gate, and as we approached nearer, we became at every step more keenly alive to the action of this wind trough. At night, we heard a distant roar as the imprisoned winds of the Dzungarian deserts escaped through this narrow defile. The only night we camped on the very shore of the straits, the wind increased to such a violence that our tents, though well protected in a valley, were by the morning all blown away, for the wind swept in great gusts over the hills, and the back eddies tore them down. The noise was terrific, and sleep out of the question. A bleak, inhospitable landscape now surrounded us. Mountains, clad in fresh snow, showed up here and there through breaks in the blurred atmosphere, and great cloud banks swept through the straits, as if rushing through some gigantic funnel. The natives relate the usual traditions as to the origin of the winds in this locality. In the myths of Central Asia, a hole in the mountain or an iron gate in a lake is the usual explanation of the origin of winds.
That description may have called to mind the darkness and fog and feathers that obfuscated the terrain around the vicinity of the Riparian Mountains. The vicinity around the Dzungarian Gate does not have very high mountains, so what about the incredible height of this range? Well, Aristeas himself didn't make it past the Isidonians, and so he may have conflated their stories of the origin of the winds with their stories of the highest of mountains, which are told across all of Asia, and probably have their basis in the Himalayas. In Asian mythologies generally, we hear of the World Mountain, which holds up the sky. The Mongols call it Mount Sumer, the Buryats call it Sumber, Indians call it Mount Meru. This mountain is in the far north and is extremely high. It's also golden. Remember, the Riparian Mountains are rich in gold, far to the north, and extremely high. And in fact, the Puranas tell of a blessed race living north of Mount Meru, the Uttarakurus. The ancient Greeks themselves were quick to pick up on the parallels between the Uttarakurus and the Hyperboreans. Megisthenes, the first Greek explorer to India, equated the Uttarakurus with Hyperboreans according to Strabo. Pliny reports the Atakori in the north of Asia who lead a life like that of the Hyperboreans. Ptolemy knew both of the Uttarakorai and Mount Meros. If Aristeas did make it to the Isidones in Central Asia, he would have heard these ultimately Indian and Chinese-derived legends, as well as the local myth about the origin of the winds in the Dzungarian Gate. If the Isidones were north of the Massagetai and east of the Scythians, as Herodotus tells us, then where were the Isidonians referring to when they spoke of the Hyperboreans? Perhaps Aristeas himself asked his hosts about the fabled Hyperboreans. The Isidonians then, hearing this description of a vegetarian, peaceful, long-lived people who ruled a terrain over the mountains that extended all the way to the sea, perhaps thought of the relatively advanced and peaceful Chinese. But perhaps not just any Chinese. In the west of China, in the Tarim Basin, at that time, there were Caucasoid, fair-haired Indo-European speakers, the Tocharians. And in fact, this matches the description of the Uttarakuru. The Kuru kingdom was the first Indian state. The Uttarakuru are treated both historically and mythologically. The Uttara Kuru were the North Kuru, lying beyond the Himalayas. The authors of these early Indian scriptures would have been aware of a linguistically related Caucasoid people lying on the other side of the Hindu Kush in the Tarim Basin. According to Indian legends, they had a republican government, but it was also a divine land. The Mahabharata calls it the ultimate abode of blessed souls. And similar to Pindar's description, The Mahabharata describes the Uttarakudu as practicing free love, but it was not sinful in their case. According to Buddhaghosa, a 5th century Buddhist writer, Jyotika, a follower of the Buddha for a time, had a wife from the Uttarakudu. Her name was Satulakai, and she brought with her a pint pot of rice and a 3-crystal stone stove that cooked rice automatically and could serve food for many people. The Indo-European invasion of both India and the Tarim Basin was likely mediated by prior settlements in the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. Perhaps that's why the Uttarakudu were regarded as a sibling population to the Kudu state. The Indo-European settlement of the Tarim Basin was resisted more by nature than by man. According to Wikipedia, the desert is completely barren, but in the late spring, the melting snows of the surrounding mountains feed streams, which have been altered by human activity to create oases with mild microclimates and supporting intensive agriculture. Remember that despite living in the far north, the Hyperboreans enjoyed an especially hospitable climate. On the northern edge of the basin, these oases occur in small valleys before the gravels. On the southern edge, they occur in alluvial fans on the edge of the sand zone. Isolated alluvial fan oases also occur in the gravel deserts of the Turpan Depression to the east of the Taklamakan. From around 2000 BC, these oases supported Bronze Age settled agricultural communities of steadily increasing sophistication. The necessary irrigation technology was first developed during the 3rd millennium BC in the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex to the west of the Pamir Mountains, but it is unclear how it reached the Tarim. The staple crops, wheat and barley, also originated in the west. So is this the answer to the Hyperborean question? Were the Hyperboreans the white settlers of Western China? I personally think this is the best way of putting together the ancient evidence that we derive from Aristeas' journey. But remember, the Greeks already knew of the Hyperboreans before Aristeas wrote his poem, and the temple at Delphi had been receiving offerings from the Hyperboreans. Could those offerings have come all the way from the Tarim Basin? Consider also that the aforementioned Protarchus, Heraclides Ponticus, and the 2nd century BC polymath Posidonius all identify the Rhipaean Mountains with the Alps and the Hyperboreans with the Celts. Many people have remarked on how the Tarim Basin mummies are often found wearing clothes that match the style and patterns of the Celts. So was there actually some basis in generically placing the Hyperboreans in the north? Not that all peoples in the north would have been Hyperboreans. The barbarous Arimaspi also lived far to the north. Instead, was there some one high culture favored by Apollo that spanned this vast geographical extent? According to Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the head of the Druidic order, which encompassed all Celtic nations, was situated in Britain. Hecataeus of Abdera, who lived from 360 to 290 BC, a Greek historian, wrote around 300 BC on the Hyperboreans, of which we have but fragments. In it was a detailed description of the mythical nation and the island where they lived, also its religious ideas. Under Hyperboreans, however, he understood a people which actually existed. His reports were consistent with what we know of the Celts of southern Britain. The Druids were an international religious order. One semi-mythical Hyperborean visitor to the Greeks was Abaris. He was described as a sage, healer, priest of Apollo, and philosopher. Plato, in the Charmides, classes Abaris among the Thracian physicians, who heal both the soul and body in tandem through incantations. Abaris was also said to have flown about the world on an arrow given to him by Apollo. Abaris was among an elite circle of mystics to associate with Pythagoras. From Porphyry's Life of Pythagoras.
It is still remembered how infallibly Pythagoras prophesied earthquakes, how swiftly he averted plagues, how he quieted tempests and hailstorms, and how he smoothed the waves of river and sea to ease his friends' crossing. Such powers, we hear, were shared too, and often exercised by Empedocles, Epimenides, and Abaris. Their own poems are clear enough evidence of this. Besides their nicknames, Empedocles the Gale-Stayer, Epimenides the Purifier, and Abaris the Sky Traveler. So called because the story went, riding on the arrow of the Hyperborean Apollo which had been given him, he traversed rivers, seas, and steeps, in a manner walking the air. Pythagoras, some have thought, had a similar experience when he conversed with the societies at Metapontum and Tauromenium on the same day.
Metapontum is where Pythagoras spent the last of his days. Recall that Aristeas, some 200 years after his death, appeared at the southern Italian city of Metapontum. Pythagoras was said to have learned from Aristeas, and because their dates don't overlap, this could not have been in the flesh. Instead, Pythagoras at Metapontum encountered the spirit of Aristeas. Pythagoras came to be known as the Hyperborean Apollo because of the way that he emulated the ethics that he learned from the Hyperborean Abaris and perhaps from the specter of Aristeas. Pythagoras was said to have remembered his past lives, and according to Diogenes Laertius, one of his past lives was the philosopher Hermotimus of Clazomenae, around the 8th or 7th century BC. He was said to have separated his soul from the body and traveled with the soul alone. Hermotimus held that mind was fundamental, according to Aristotle. According to Aristotle, Anaxagoras actually took that doctrine from Hermotimus. This set of mystic philosophers associated with Pythagoras was also associated with Apollo and the Hyperboreans. Epimenides, a contemporary of Pythagoras from Crete, slept for 57 years. He was described as a seer and philosopher. Pausanias reports that when Epimenides died, his skin was found to be covered with tattooed writing. This was considered odd because the Greeks reserved tattooing for slaves. Some modern scholars have seen this as evidence that Epimenides was heir to the shamanistic religions of Central Asia, because tattooing is often associated with shamanic initiation. Pliny the Elder says, Hermotimus, Aristeas, and Epimenides all died and lived again. In a passage preserved by Clement, possibly originating from Heraclides Ponticus, Abaris, Aristeas, Epimenides, Zoroaster, Empedocles, and Empedocles were all associated with Pythagoras. Pythagoras, Empedocles, Epimenides, Aristeas, and Zoroaster have stories involving reincarnation. Pythagoras, Abaris, Aristeas, Epimenides, Zoroaster, and Phormio all had trance experiences or journeys of the soul. Empedocles experimented with cataleptic trance. Could this capacity for journeys in the soul, or astral projection, or remote viewing, have been essential to the vast but disconnected extent of the Hyperborean peoples? Trance states and journeys into the other world have been practiced in shamanic Siberian religion for tens of thousands of years. Is this victory over space and time what allowed the Hyperboreans to enjoy their blessed condition, free from the constraints of ordinary human subsistence, war, grief, and old age? The Hyperboreans are described as having practiced music constantly, as having understood medicinal principles that join the soul and the body in holistic healing. And from some of these narratives, we may infer that at least some Hyperboreans were parapsychological adepts, having abilities of remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, and astral projection. We notice the similarities between the practice that Pythagoras, the Hyperborean Apollo, developed and what some of these other ancient Greek sages with connections to the Hyperboreans and some Hyperboreans themselves were said to have practiced. So, historically speaking, we might say that out of Siberian and old European shamanistic traditions, a certain set of technologies, psychological technologies, was developed and shared across a wide area. Paleolithic societies were largely migratory, and so spiritual techniques and musical techniques could have been propagated over hundreds or thousands of miles by essentially one high culture of experts. What the Hyperboreans then represent is a way, a path, and not necessarily one distinct group. It's a way that was open to human beings from the Paleolithic. It just requires musical practice, philosophical work, and the cultivation of trance-like states where the soul can separate from the body. Myths manifest to us forms of the possible that we are related to. Certain paths are open, certain types of experience are available, certain heightened, symbolic, condensed expressions naturally present themselves. Similar myths are told not only because of cultural transmission, but also because human beings naturally share in these same elementary ideas. The Hyperborean path is one archetypal possibility for mankind that has been there for tens of thousands of years, and it remains a possibility. These possibilities in myth present themselves narratively on the edges of the known world. That's why tales of mythological creatures and peoples occur in places like the Hyrcanian woods, or in Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind. There are monsters out in the distant ocean. And this isn't just a convenient place to hide mythological creatures, which would otherwise be proved not to exist. Instead, we have to recognize that these forms of the possible do influence the development of human societies and human action, and they naturally are most potent in those liminal realms where well-defined classical information and human knowledge hasn't led to a thoroughly fixed and determined reality. Instead, on the borders of our experience, on the borders of the possible, we can encounter these archetypes. And in the case of the Hyperboreans, I think we still do. Just like Aristeas and some of these other Greek sages would experience a state of paralysis, followed by the disappearance of the body in some cases, and a journey of the soul. So today, in UFO abduction narratives, people describe a state of paralysis, followed by a disappearance for a period of days or sometimes even years, during which the abductee is shown aspects of reality that they had not had access to before. In the famous case of Bob Lazar, what he came back reporting was the nature of this alien race, in that they were unnaturally tall and effectively looked Nordic. The Nordics are a well-documented, recurring archetype in ufology. I'm not suggesting that the ancient Hyperboreans took to the skies or that they were descended from outer space invaders. I'm saying humanity has had access to this very real and potent archetype of human simplicity, beauty, proportion, musicality. If we allow ourselves to entertain the idea of the multiverse, then there are worlds out there where this path of human simplicity, proportion, beauty has been taken. These Hyperborean races are out there, and there are ways, definite ways, of contacting these entities, and perhaps the more sensitive among us can still follow in the footsteps of Aristeas and make contact with those Hyperboreans, favorites of a